and welcome to another edition of What Matters Most. This is our fourth program. Can you believe it? It's been quite a while. We launched this back in October, and this show is aired out of Londonderry. My name is Luisa. I'm your host. And we have also, our producer, Aaron Barry, and we have Helen, who is our producer also behind the cameras. And today I have the pleasure of introducing you to a wonderful guest. We have Alan Hoffman, who is a retired attorney who lives here in Londonderry, New Hampshire. He has been interested in the wonderful story of General Lafayette, who helped to fight in the American Revolution, and he has translated a wonderful book about Lafayette. And so I have been a long time, I would say, lover of anything French, France, the French language, the French culture, and I live in Londonderry, so I thought Alan has to be on the show. Alan, welcome to What Matters Most. Welcome to our show.
Thank you so much.
I'm so happy to have you here, and I'm excited to have this conversation about somebody who was an exciting general, to say the least. How would you like to describe yourself and your interest in Lafayette?
Well, as you mentioned, I am a retired lawyer. I practiced law for about 50 years in Boston, trial law, and but I was always a lover of history. And in college, the last 2 years, I took all American history. I loved it. And I loved the early part of American history. So whenever a book came out from that period and I got wind of it, I would buy it and read it. And in 2002, I read a book by Andrew Burstein about the 50th anniversary of the country, 1826. And the whole first chapter was about Lafayette's farewell tour visit to the U.S. And I said to myself, what was all the fuss about? The parades, the banquets, the balls, the toasts, dedication of public buildings like the Bunker Hill Monument. And that piqued my interest, and I started reading voraciously about Lafayette. I joined two Lafayette societies. I'm now president of both, the Massachusetts Lafayette Society and the American Friends of Lafayette, which has been around since 1932. And in the course of my research, I wanted to read the book written by Lafayette's private secretary. His name was Auguste Levasseur, about the farewell tour, which was a 13-month trip to the U.S. in 1824 and 1825, and the general was 67 years old. And at that time, I couldn't find it in English, but I found it in French at the Brattle Bookshop, and they brought 2 volumes. They brought it down from the top shelf of their rare book room on the 3rd floor and dusted it off, and I opened the volume 1, and I was able to sight read it. I was surprised because I had taken a lot of French in high school, 6 or 7 years actually, from the 6th grade perhaps. And I did very well in it, but I didn't realize how much I had retained. So I bought it. I brought it home to my wife, Marilyn, whom you know. She's in the
She's fluent in French.
Club
that's
with
right.
you.
Yes,
and she's
right.
really fluent in French.
She's fluent, absolutely.
And I said, Marilyn, guess what I bought? And I lay it on a table. She opens it up. She says, it's in French. What are you going to do with it? And I said, well, I'm going to translate it. It'll be my hobby. And she says, well, I hope you're not going to ask me for help. I've got a life, which she does. I said, no, it'll be my project.
I totally empathize with that. I would react the same way.
So 2 years later, I finished the translation, got it published. It's now in the 3rd printing.
Wow, that's amazing. And I don't know a whole lot about Lafayette, but what I retained from reading bits and pieces of your writings and attending some of your lectures, you go around giving lectures and really educating the American public about this general. What I know is that he was a 19-year-old young man coming from France. How did he embark on this journey, and why did he get this passion to come to the United States?
Yeah, well, that's a matter of dispute among historians. But I think the consensus today is that he was inspired by the ideals of the American Revolution. He was already a Freemason from the age of 17, and that society usually brought together the liberal aristocracy. And he decided to come. He came against the will of his family, namely his father-in-law. His mother and father were no longer around, but the fact that they were no longer around made him one of the richest men in France. He inherited his father's
the wealth,
lands and title. He was called the Marquis de Lafayette.
That's right.
And his mother's estates and wealth. So he had a lot of freedom in that regard. But anyhow, he basically snuck out of the country. He negotiated with the American representative, who at that time was Silas Deane, and later joined by Benjamin Franklin. And he bought a ship. He had about 12 to 14 other officers who wanted to come, and they left and came to America. He showed up in South Carolina, Georgetown, and then Charlestown, and he was lionized in Charlestown, and then they marched up to Philadelphia, and he was able to join the American Army as a major general, a title that he negotiated.
For a young man.
He was 19 years old.
With no experience.
No combat experience.
No combat experience.
He had been in the Army for 3 or 4 years. But anyhow, he was a major general, but initially without a command. During the Battle of the Brandywine, a few months later, he arrived in June of '77. He joined the Army, met Washington on August 31st, 1777, and on July 31st. But on September 11th, it was a big battle, and he was supposed to be at this point just a volunteer without a command, but he got permission to ride up into the combat when the American forces were retreating. He was able to help to turn them around and face the British. He was shot in the left leg and wounded.
Right, he got wounded in that battle, and that kind of gave him some kind of notoriety. He became known in the United States, and that was his desire. A lot of people think that he was not able to be in combat positions when he was living in France, and he wanted, this was a young man who was full of energy, full of excitement for accomplishing something. He wasn't just doing it because he was a rich, wealthy aristocrat from France. He wanted to make a difference. And here we are. Now he's known all over the United States as somebody who got wounded fighting for American independence.
Yeah. So that wound, and then he was carried off the field and taken to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania to recuperate. But that wound, as you point out, kind of made his reputation. A friend of mine whose name is Bruce Maude just published a book, Lafayette at Brandywine, and it's all about how that wound symbolically made him a hero and enabled him to do so many other important things for the Americans. Like in 1779, he went back to France to lobby for more for French land troops, for the return of the French fleet. By that time, we were already allies of the French. And he was successful. So they sent him back in 1780 to tell Washington that General Rochambeau was arriving.
That's right. Who was going to lead the American, the French Army's help to the American Revolution.
With the French Expeditionary Force.
Right. And why did they not appoint Lafayette? I mean, he was a young man, but why did the French not give him that
He was
leading
ambitious enough to want the appointment. He argued with the ministers, Vergennes and Maurepas, that he had such good relations with the Americans, he would be the best one to lead these troops. It would facilitate their cooperating with the American troops. But he was only like 21 at the time, 21 and a half. Right. And they said, no, we'll go with the experienced
general.
Experienced and Rochambeau was. So he was a very experienced. Officer. He was older than Washington, actually.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And I'm just so excited. I could sit here for hours because I'm also a lover of history. his relationship with George Washington. George Washington was somebody who did not have a biological child. Could it have been some kind of a father-son relationship that developed over time? And how did George Washington, our founder, the first president of the United States, trust this young man from France?
Well, I like to refer to Washington as Lafayette's paternal friend. Some historians call him like an adopted son. I don't go quite that
Not
far,
quite
but
as
they
far.
they were very close. For whatever reason, Washington, Lafayette was an engaging person. He had a wonderful sense of humor. He could be very self-effacing. There's the story that Lafayette reports in his memoir that in August, when they marched into Philadelphia together, and with the American troops, this is before the Battle of the Brandywine, Washington said to Lafayette, they were on horseback, he said, it must be embarrassing to you, an officer of the great French nation, to be part of this army, this ragtag army, with homespun clothes, no real uniforms. And Lafayette replied to Washington, "I've come to learn, not to teach."
Wow.
That's what he said.
And this takes me to one of the reasons why I'm excited about this French fighter general. He had some love of justice in his heart. He could have been gone like many others. There were some officers from France that had come here for notoriety, and they were turned back. George Washington did not want them. They were proven to not be worthy, of being included in the U.S. Army, in the American independence fighters, militias, and they were sent back. But this man wanted truly to make a difference, and he had a very strong sense of justice. How do we capture that? I mean, how can you explain that, that kind of sense? He was an abolitionist, and you talked about that.
Well, yes, he did have a strong sense of justice. At the time he came to America, he certainly was not an abolitionist, but he came to see that the best way to assure natural rights, human rights, was through national revolutions. That was one of the things he came to see. And therefore, throughout his life, he supported national revolutions to overthrow aristocracies and monarchies, etc., and foreign rulers. So he supported revolutions, of course, in France, the French Revolution, and the second one in 1830, in Spain in the early 1820s, in Greece, in Poland, and in South America.
He was the Che Guevara of the 19th century, I would say.
I don't know about that. But that kind of got him started thinking about natural rights, human rights. And somehow by 1783, slavery came to be, in his mind, a scourge that had to be eradicated. He wrote a letter to George Washington after the peace treaty was signed with Britain in early 1783, and he says in the letter, and I'm paraphrasing, "Now that, my dear general, that you will have a lot of time on your hands, you and I should buy a plantation in America and free the slaves and have them serve as day laborers. And with your name attached to this project, it will become an example to others." And then he said, if this be, he didn't use the word crazy, if this be insane, I'd rather be mad on this tack than sane on the other tack. Well, George Washington wrote a very nice reply, somewhat patronizing, but said, let's discuss it when you come visit. He did visit in 1784. There's no account of what was said, but they didn't do it. So Lafayette in 1785, he and his wife, Adrienne, who was a remarkable woman, they bought a plantation in French Guiana, Cayenne, and they did that. They hired an overseer, gave him specific instructions. They had the slaves work as day laborers and earn a paycheck, and when they earned a certain amount, they
Wow.
could obtain their freedom.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Back then,
Yeah.
what an example.
So then in the late 1780s, he joined anti-slavery societies in 3 countries, in Britain, France, and and Alexander Hamilton's in America. And throughout his life, this was an important cause for him. You find him in the early 1820s debating Thomas Jefferson in correspondence. Jefferson believed at that time that it was desirable to expand slavery into all the territories,
Right.
because by doing that, you would improve conditions in the tidewater, and everyone's life will be improved. And Lafayette would write back saying, "My dear Mr. Jefferson, do you really believe that by spreading this scourge, we will end it?" You know, and they go back and forth. When he was here for the farewell tour, he didn't come out swinging on the slavery issue, probably because he was the guest of the nation. He was actually called the nation's guest. But he did, by symbolic actions, show how he felt and where he was coming from. For example, in New York City, the African Free School, which was a product of the Anti-Slavery Society, he visited them. He made a point to visit that school. There was an ex-slave who was a double agent for him at Yorktown, whose name is James Armistead, now James Lafayette. In 1784, Lafayette wrote a testimonial for him, which ultimately led to his being freed by the Virginia legislature. In 1824, he spotted James in a parade at Yorktown and went and embraced him.
Wow.
And the newspaper reporter thought that was so amazing that this man would go and embrace a black man in public like that. In 1825, when he was in New Orleans, he specifically asked the governor to meet with a brigade of freemen, black freedmen, who had fought with Jackson in the War of 1812. After the speeches were over, he went around and shook each one by hand.
Oh, wow.
You know.
That's some incredible
Yeah,
story
so
back
he
then.
he
was his own person. He was not influenced by the times. You know, a lot of American, I would say, politicians and elected officials had slaves back home.
Absolutely.
Congress was
absolutely.
full of people representing the American people who still owned slaves. And this man is showing them that there's a better way of doing things.
He was not infected by race prejudice. There's an African American historian, the first one, whose name is William Cooper Nell of Boston, and he wrote a book called The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution. There's an appendix about Lafayette and, believe it or not, Kosciuszko, who was also an abolitionist. But when he talks about Lafayette, he makes the specific point, actually I think he makes the point about both of them, that these heroes were not infected by race prejudice.
I love that. I just so love that. Infected by this, what I call a disease.
Yeah. So there's an after party story, or an after story, about Lafayette. So he dies in 1834. He was very friendly with the British abolitionist Thomas Clarkson. In 1789, Clarkson came over and tried to persuade the French revolutionaries to abolish the slave trade, because they were trying to do that in England. And every time at a parliamentary debate, the opponents would say, but then the French will make all the money and they'll be more powerful than they are now. So he spent a lot of time with Lafayette, and they became friendly. And they developed and kept a friendship.
That's
and there's
right.
correspondence in the 18-teens. And Clarkson came to France on about 4 missions for the anti-slavery movement, and spent time with Lafayette. Well, in 1845, 11 years after Lafayette's death, he wrote a letter to a fellow traveler in the abolitionist movement, a woman whose name was Maria Weston Chapman. She was a deputy to William Lloyd Garrison at the Liberator. And in the letter, And let me see, I should quote it. Well, I don't have to quote it. Here,
I want to see
in the
it.
letter,
Show and tell.
he says that he knew Lafayette well, and the only subject he ever saw him angry about was slavery. And on more than frequently, I heard him say, "I would never have drawn my sword in the cause of America if I could conceive that thereby I was founding a land of slavery." So this is a broadside.
I would never have drawn my sword in the cause of America if I could have conceived that thereby I was founding a land of slavery.
So this became
What a visionary.
This became a popular slogan for the abolitionists. It was in speeches by Charles Sumner, by Wendell Phillips, and of course Williams Cooper Nell in his appendix includes this quote. And it was very important for them to do that because I have another show and tell.
I love it. I love it. Thanks for bringing those.
Because
Thank you.
Lafayette at that time was the most popular man in America from the farewell tour. That's why we have 80 cities and towns and counties
That's right,
named for
so
him.
many towns. And then we will be talking shortly after your show and tell about the connection to New Hampshire.
Yes.
It would be fantastic.
But anyhow, just to give an example of his popularity, this is a colored broadside from the same year that the letter containing that statement was published. And it was used in the schools. It has a lot of printed information about, for example, population statistics, battles of the American Revolution and the War of 1812, a list of famous men. Around the perimeter are the seals of all the states and the then territories, including New Hampshire's there somewhere. But there are 3 images under the title Pictorial History of the United States, and you see Washington in the middle, and on Washington's left hand is Benjamin Franklin. And on his right hand is not Adams, Hamilton, Jefferson, Madison, or Jackson, but Lafayette. Under the title Pictorial History of the United States. So that's how important he was as of 1846 as a result of the farewell tour. And that's why this statement was utilized by them to effect during the abolitionist campaigns.
That's right. It's a beautiful statement. I think we, there's so much to talk about this connection. And can you tell us the connection with New Hampshire? Because a lot of times we forget that Lafayette visited so many cities, and you just mentioned that Lafayette's name is on many streets and buildings throughout the United States. So
yes, so Lafayette visited New Hampshire on 2 occasions during the farewell tour. He had been to Portsmouth in 1784 and perhaps earlier during the American Revolution. But in 1824, he left Boston on August 31st. He went to Chelsea for events. He went to Chelsea, Lynn, Marblehead, Salem, Ipswich, and he slept in Newburyport. And it was a rainy day, and he had events in all of those places, and I may have missed one. And then on the following morning, September 1, he went up what is called the Lafayette Road, which goes through Greenland and up into Hampton, Northampton, and Salem. And Portsmouth. And he spent the day in Portsmouth. Well, while he was there were school children paraded, also in the rain. There were speeches, and a very wonderful speech by the head of the city council. It's one of my favorite speeches. And basically what he was saying was that we honor our patriots who fought in the American Revolution. But after all, they were fighting for their families and for their property.
Right.
You came from a foreign land, and you didn't have to come. And you came because of your love of the human race.
Altruistic, totally.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
And anyhow, that was the speech. And then he replied, he visited the John Langdon's house, which still exists, which is a historic site, and freshened up there. Then there was a ball.
All right.
And at about midnight, he left the ball in a carriage, and he arrived at Boston probably 5 or 6 a.m., freshened up for a few hours, and headed for Lexington, Massachusetts.
Wow.
On his way back to New York, where he went to Lexington, Concord, Bolton, Worcester, Sturbridge, Charlton, et cetera, into Connecticut.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
And can you tell us about the creation of the Lafayette Heritage Trail here in New Hampshire?
I will tell you about the trail, but I want to also
Sure, go ahead.
I want to also talk about the 1825 visit, which was more extensive. That's the one where he came through
I see.
Londonderry.
Okay. Oh, really? Okay.
So in 1825, he had returned to Boston to help lay the cornerstone of the Bunker Hill Monument. After that was through, he headed north and going through Reading, Andover, Methuen, and he entered New Hampshire, went to Salem, and then on the Londonderry Turnpike, he went to Londonderry. And now it's Derry, but it wasn't Derry until 1826 when Derry split off.
Right,
it was
right.
the eastern
It was
part of
Nutfield
London.
or something. It was called Nutfield.
Well, Nutfield is Manchester,
Oh, okay.
but
okay.
Londonderry included all of Derry
Right.
originally.
Right.
And in fact, East Derry now is the oldest part of Londonderry. So he stopped at a school, the Adams Female Academy, and the building still stands. It's on Lane Road, just behind the First Parish. I think it's the street behind the First Parish. It was rainy again. It was always rainy. And the girls were all dressed in white, and he was late. So finally he arrived, and he said a few words, shook everyone's hand, and he continued north. He went to Pinkerton, basically.
Right, Pinkerton, which is now
And
Pinkerton
there is
Academy.
a Lafayette Trail marker now at the near the traffic circle, which would be between the Adams Female Academy and Pinkerton Academy. And then he slept in Pembroke, and the next day, he went into Concord, and it was a wonderful event. General Benjamin Pierce, Franklin Pierce's father, was the host of the event. There were speeches in the State House. They had set up a banquet table. There were several hundred veterans from the American Revolution, and there were other guests. And Benjamin Pierce scooped the wine glass that Lafayette drank from, and it's now an important heirloom in the museum of the New Hampshire Historical Society.
Oh, wow.
But during this speech, during this event, there were several song poems, both to an old tune that was current at the time. But in one of them, the first stanza ends. It's generally something like from north to south, east to west, people have come to see Lafayette, or Lafayette has come. But then it says, the granite state to see. This is 1825, June. The first time it is recorded that Granite State was used as the name of New Hampshire.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's history.
Yeah.
You brought history to us. You know, we live in sleepy Londonderry, but this place is so full of wonderful American history.
So then he headed, the next day he headed east along what is now Route 4 and stopped in several places, Northbridge briefly, Durham and Dover, and then he went into Maine, came back, headed back to Concord. Then he had to get to Vermont. Now this is near the end of his trip, and the only state he hadn't visited after Maine, which he had just visited, was Vermont. So he headed west, and he went through a number of towns, and I won't get them all probably, but Hopkinton, New London, and I can't think of the town on the coast. But anyhow, in that last town, he stayed overnight, and then the next day, he went up to Cornish, went over the Cornish Bridge, and the authorities in New Hampshire deposited him with the authorities in Vermont, and then he went through Vermont and ultimately went back to New York and then Washington, D.C., from which he left. Now, the Lafayette Trail is an invention of a young Frenchman whose name is Julien Ichet.
That's right. I actually had the pleasure of meeting him because, as Alan mentioned earlier, I'm friends with Marilyn Hoffman, his wife, and we belong to a French book club. And I was able to meet Julien, who is you're a mentor to Julien, really.
Well, I was a mentor, and Marilyn and I were his hosts. He stayed with us for 5 months
Wow.
in 2017 and another 6 months, I think, in 2019.
Amazing.
And what he was doing in this country was researching and marking, first researching the Lafayette Trail, documenting all his stops with firsthand information, and creating a website. And the website exists, it's called The Lafayette Trail. But then, during the course of all this work, and the American Friends of Lafayette basically raised the funding for this. During the course of all this work, one of the foundations that he interviewed with loved the project, and this is called the Pomeroy Foundation, and they do signage, and they authorized Julien to research and place 175 signs on what will be the Lafayette Trail.
That's amazing.
And New Hampshire is way ahead of any of the states. It's been very active. I think he has 8 or 9 signs in New Hampshire, in some of these towns that I mentioned.
That's
and
incredible.
On May 20th of 2022, there will be a Lafayette Trail sign dedicated at the State House where that banquet occurred. Now, May 20th is an important date in Lafayette history. He died on May 20 in 1834.
Really? So he was born September 6th, 1785?
1757.
1757, right.
And the 100th anniversary of his death, there were events all over the country, but the big one was at a joint session of Congress. President Roosevelt spoke, et cetera, et cetera. And as a result of that activity, Massachusetts in 1935 passed a bill declaring May 20th Massachusetts Lafayette Day, and instructed that the governor has to issue a proclamation every year. And one of the organizations I'm involved with, the Massachusetts Lafayette Society, marks that day. We make sure the governor issues the proclamation. We have ceremonies, and in non-COVID years, we have luncheons at speakers, etc. New Hampshire in 1950 followed suit, and they did so after their elm tree, which was called the Lafayette elm, which stood at the State House, died. And as a result of that, they wanted to do something. So they passed a bill with the identical language, except substituting the state of New Hampshire for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. There is a New Hampshire Lafayette Day, May 20th. And that's the day that has been chosen to commemorate the marker, which is going up, the Lafayette Trail marker.
At that spot where the tree was.
Yes,
the marker will be
but
there.
since that time, about 10 years ago, we had events on May 20th. It was a year that one of the descendants of Lafayette was present, and we planted a new elm.
Tree.
Right.
A new elm tree.
So there is another one.
Oh, right. That's just amazing. And when will this trail be finished so people can visit?
Well, you can visit it. I mean, it's a trail, for the public. You can drive to places and stop. I believe Julien has placed about 60 markers. And the goal is to get this finished in time for the bicentennial of the farewell tour.
Oh, that's right.
Which is
it's coming up. So
August of 1824 it'll start.
Right. That's amazing. I am so excited about this. I see that there's another show and tell we haven't seen. Is that a battle picture of a battlefield, or?
Well, this is a story that was told to me by the historian of the National Guard, the Massachusetts historian, who was a very nice man. So when Lafayette, he visited New York on 3 occasions, 3 fairly long trips. And on the last one, which was 1825, he spent a couple of weeks, and some of it was rest time. He got to rest up.
Yeah.
But on the day he left to go to New Jersey on his way to Washington, a state militia, which is actually the predecessor of the 7th Regiment. There's a 7th Regiment Armory in New York. But they had changed their name to reflect to be called the National Guard. And the reason they had changed their name was that during the First French Revolution in 1789, Lafayette was appointed the head of the National Guard of Paris.
Oh, wow.
And that was an important role for him. He kept order in France for a year or two before things went south, so to speak. But anyhow, this is a poster of a painting that the National Guard, U.S. National Guard, commissioned in 1989, 200th anniversary of the French Revolution, and it shows Lafayette saying farewell to this unit, this militia unit. And in the legend, it points out that by the end of the 19th century, every state militia in the country had renamed itself National Guard. That's why it's called National Guard. It's from Lafayette and his role in the French Revolution.
The French Revolution, that's incredible.
This is a present for you, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Oh my goodness. I will treasure this. This is wonderful. I'm definitely going to put this up somewhere prominent. Thank you for bringing it along. I think I'm going to be a student of Lafayette too. I just
well, to further your studies, I've brought you, and I thought I was bringing you part 1 and part 2 of the Gazette of the American Friends of Lafayette. But I brought you 2 part 1s, so I'm going to have to get you part 2. Our printer cannot bind. It's gotten to be so long. It's now 150 pages. He cannot bind it with one clip. So I will get the other.
Sure.
The 2 part 2s.
That's great.
To you.
Here it is. And can you tell us your website so that our viewers can visit and learn more about Lafayette?
So the website of the American Friends of Lafayette, where you can see all the gazettes online as well, is www.friendsoflafayette.org. And there's also a place where you can join. And then I'll give you at least one other website of the Massachusetts Lafayette Society, and that is LafayetteSocietyMA.org. And our website also has a place where you can join.
That's amazing. And that brings us to a question that I always ask my guests. You've had a wonderful career as an attorney, and you're a lover of history, and you live in New Hampshire, but Massachusetts is where you worked. So you are a New Englander. I know that you started off, was it Yale?
Yale
went
College.
To Yale. So can you tell us a little bit about your trajectory in life and what brought you to be the person you are, and how you view what matters most? Because we want people to be motivated, and we talk a lot here about health and education and unity and family as being what matters most. We live in a country that's divided, and that does not, we have to mention it every time we are on this show, because I always say I love everybody. I want people to be united and to work together and forget their differences. How can you help with this mission of uniting the people.
Wow.
It's powerful, but it's important, isn't it?
Yeah. So you said all the right things. What matters most is family, health, and satisfaction with your work, and those are extremely important things. And family has, to me, become even more important with COVID. I mean, we
right.
used to spend a lot of time with our two children and cousins and whatnot, and for a year and a half, it's been other than for a brief period, like from, I don't know, April to October of this year, it was much less so. So you've hit all the right notes. One of the reasons that I am so impassioned about Lafayette is I do think that he can serve as an example to
He's an
all
inspiration
of us.
to all of us,
An
isn't he?
inspiration. In fact, during his farewell tour visit, it wasn't a time of peacefulness. There was an election campaign, and it was vigorously fought. There were 4 candidates, and Jackson, this was 1824, Jackson won the popular vote, and he had a plurality of the electoral vote, but he didn't have enough. He didn't have a majority. It went to the House of Representatives. But when Lafayette came during this campaign, they kind of put the rancor aside, and they all spent a lot of time honoring Lafayette. And Lafayette was friendly with everyone. I mean, he had known John Quincy Adams, who ultimately was elected president, from Quincy Adams' stints in Europe with his father and as an ambassador on his own right. And he met Jackson on the stairwell of a hotel or an inn in Washington, D.C., and they hit it off beautifully, actually.
It's the way we should go. And I keep emphasizing that the most important thing is to treat your fellow human being the way you'd like to be treated. I think that should be foundational. That should be how we treat, whether or not they disagree with us, they should be treated with some dignity, and we shouldn't discriminate. And needless to say that the message of this show is about unity and about making people learn, because with an education, people have something to work with. And I'm hoping that with this show, we're going to bring lots more education to our fellow residents of Londonderry, of New Hampshire, of the United States, and the rest of the world, because I found out that our show is watched all over. I got a comment from a viewer from Africa saying that flower you had there was a bit too tall. And thank you for that commentary. I don't decorate that much, but sometimes I bring some flowers or something here to the stable, but it's just been such an enormous pleasure to have you. And is there anything else you'd like to add about this opportunity to bring the history of
just
Lafayette?
that I am designated as a scholar to go in the
Congratulations.
New Hampshire.
Congratulations.
What is it called? New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. Not Charitable Foundation, the New Hampshire Humanities Council. And I have been for a number of years, but the talk that I now give is called Lafayette and Human Rights, and there will be a free Zoom presentation of it sponsored by the Lee Historical Society and Library, LEE. It's 2 weeks from today at 7 p.m. There should be a link to register on the Lee Historical Society's website.
So it's going to be, so today's the 19th, and that would take us to February 3rd, 4th,
I think it's
thereabout.
the 3rd, but it's a Wednesday. It's definitely a Wednesday.
Is there a website for that event?
Yes, it's on the, I'm sure it's on the Lee Historical Society. It might also be on the Lee Library.
Historical Society.
And I have a website for my book, and I posted it as well, but it doesn't have the link.
Okay.
So you want to
So
get the link.
just search Lee Historical Society and the
Yeah.
event will be there, and you'll be able to attend one of Alan Hoffman's lectures. I've had the pleasure of attending one of his lectures, and I'm going to sign up for more. I hope you enjoyed the show, and I'm so glad and I'm grateful to you for taking the time. I know you were not well recently. You had some surgery, but you made it to the show. And,
Oh, no, I'm fine.
and you made it, interesting and educational. And I hope that you can come back again to talk about this amazing general. I call him General. Should I refer to him as General Lafayette?
Yes.
So.
There's a story about that.
Oh, really?
You know, he was originally born the Marquis, well, he became the Marquis de Lafayette when his father was killed in the Battle of Minden in 1759.
Right.
And then during the French Revolution, he and others, they passed a bill eradicating titles. And yet when Napoleon came back, all the titles came back. You could have the titles, and then again when the Bourbons came back, et cetera, et cetera. Lafayette never resumed his title. He was always he would sign his letters Lafayette.
Right. He's, wow, what an example to us all.
Yeah.
Thank you so much,
That's
Alan,
quite all
for
right.
coming to our show and come back again.
I'd love it.
Thank you. And to everyone who has been listening and will listen, thank you. Thank you for your time. And I thank Aaron and Helen for being behind the scenes, editing and watching the cameras. And, to everyone just go out and enjoy February. It's a bit cold here in New Hampshire, but if you're elsewhere in the country, you're okay. But over here, we're at the height of the winter. Thank you for watching the show, and we'll see you next month.